The river and through the woods. Da, 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 da. Thank you. Hello. We're here. We're all like within driving distance of home, so we're here. Thank you. All right. So we're going to start with a clicker question. There we go. That's a big surprise. Okay, here we go. Whoops. No, we're not going yet. Go. Why is this not? Uh-oh. No. There. Well, we will start with a clicker question, but just a second. Let me close this, unplug this, plug it back in, plug that in. Oh. Slight technical difficulties. Hold on. Ah, there it is. All right, there we go. I'm up and running. There's your clicker question. When the Fed increases interest rates, what happens? A, B, C, D, or E? I'm going to try to move this and make sure it doesn't. My thing's not working again. There. All right, so when the Fed increases interest rates, what happens? A, B, C, D, or E? There you go. We should have no more clicks than we have people. If a friend sent their clicker with you, don't use it, because I walk around using two clickers. I take them both and zero out all the points. So just say, oh, God, she was just mean, I say. Okay, 1001, 2, and 3, and stop. And, just a minute, I'm getting there. There. Ouch. 55%. Not so good. So when the Fed increases interest rates, increases in interest rates are contractionary policy. Contractionary policy means those are things that are contracting or shrinking GDP. They're things that are contracting or shrinking aggregate demand. Higher interest rates have the same effect on net exports as they have on investment spending. So if you get the investment spending part, the net exports are going to go in the same direction. It's not as if interest rates have opposite effects on two different components. It's not as if interest rates have different effects on two different components of aggregate demand. Interest rates have the same effect. Higher interest rates decrease investment spending and decrease net exports. Lower interest rates increase investment spending and increase net exports. Those two effects aren't offsetting each other, they're compounding each other. So increases in interest rates decreases investment and decreases net exports. It's really important that you get that down. So 55% are cool, 45% need to work on it, make sure that you get that straight so we get up to 100%. Okay, a new slide, I tweeted that I added a couple of slides. This is from the textbook, so you don't have to write it down, just write down C-text, page 221. The language that's in the textbook that I suggest that we use comes from the language of strategic planning, which is goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics. The reason I suggest in the book using this language, Mariko, I feel like my volume is up a little bit high. The reason I suggest using this language is because there's a lot of different terminology that gets tossed around out there. There's targets, there's tools, and so if we just agree this is a common language we're going to start from, it might be helpful. A goal is a generalized sort of what you want to achieve in sort of broad strokes fashion, so stable prices, for instance, which is one of the two parts of the dual mandate of the Fed. An objective is a measurable goal. So an objective is something that you can see you did or did not achieve it because you did or did not achieve the goal. It's going to have some sort of number or some sort of quantitative measurable thing associated with it. So for instance, inflation rate of 2% would be an objective. And then there's a strategy by which the Fed hopes to achieve that objective. So the strategy might be, for instance, increasing or setting the federal funds rate at 3% would be an example of a strategy. So this is what we're going to do as a way of achieving our objective, which is the way that we're going to achieve our goal. And then there's some tactic. What is it that they do in order to implement that strategy? And so for instance, we started talking about Monday and we'll finish up today talking about selling financial assets as a tactic for achieving a goal. So the language that we see a lot, though, is monetary policy tools. So what's a tool? Well, I wrote up the slide and then I edited the slide because the tools we're going to talk about, one tool we'll talk about is changing the federal funds rate, and then I'm going to talk about the new tool that the Fed is introducing, which is changing the interest rate they pay on excess reserves. Are those strategies or are they tactics? Don't get hung up on it. So the big takeaway here is please don't sweat whether a tool is a strategy or a tactic. Okay? So I don't want you to come in all stressed out about whether or not something is a strategy or a tactic. The tools are, sometimes we're going to talk about them as strategies and sometimes we're going to talk about them as tactics. You'll see as we go along. So this just links back to what's in the textbook. If you don't have time to write all this down, just write down that first line, page 221 in the textbook. All right. So what's the traditional tool? The traditional tool of monetary policy is changes in the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is related to the fact that banks, as I mentioned on Monday, are required to hold reserves at least equal to 10% of their total deposits. So we want our banks to have a balance in their reserve account. That's how they clear checks that are written on one bank but deposited in another. If the bank does not have enough reserves, they can borrow from other banks. The Federal Reserve is really concerned that the whole banking system have enough reserves and is less concerned that any individual bank have enough reserves on any given day. So they have a strategy for checking this. I didn't double check my facts, so don't write this down. It's something like they're going to look at the total number of deposits as of 5 o'clock Wednesday. That would be today. And then they'll look at the reserves 2 weeks from today. And the reserves 2 weeks from today have to be at least 10% of the deposits as of 5 o'clock today. So there's a little bit of a time lag, so they have some time to adjust their reserve balances if they don't have enough. It's not a simultaneous, contemporaneous sort of requirement. So the banks, if they are short on reserves, they have some time to do something about it. What the banks can do, if they don't have enough reserves, if they're not at that 10% level, they can borrow reserves from other banks. So if Wells Fargo Bank has a lot of excess reserves and the Bank of America is short on reserves, the Bank of America can borrow from Wells Fargo Bank. These are overnight loans because they are checking the balance in the reserve account at a particular time on a particular day. I think it's Wednesday at 5 o'clock. And comparing that with the total amount of deposits a couple of weeks prior. It can just be an overnight loan. They just have to have enough in their reserve account at that moment when the Fed checks the balance, and then they can give it back the next day. The federal funds rate is the name of the interest rate that the lending bank, in my example, I think it was Wells Fargo, would charge to the borrowing bank, which in my example was Bank of America, for that overnight loan. So it's not going to be a lot of dollars. It's going to be expressed as an annualized rate. It's the interest rate that banks charge on these overnight loans of reserves to other banks, loans that are brokered in order to meet the reserve requirement. So we can think about the market for federal funds in the same way that we think about any other market that we've talked about. So we're going to put the price of federal funds up here on the vertical axis, and we're going to put the quantity of federal funds down here on the horizontal axis. Excuse me. Let me get rid of that frog. The price of federal funds, that's just the federal funds rate. So we're going to use FFR for federal funds rate. That's the rate, the price of loans. The demand for federal funds, which is some downward sloping demand for federal funds. The demand for federal funds, that's banks whose total reserves are less than their required reserves. So I'll use RR to stand for required reserves. The supply of federal funds, some upward sloping supply of federal funds line, that's banks who have some excess reserves. So banks whose total reserves are greater than their required reserves. I'm not using TR as my shorthand for total reserves because we already use TR to stand for transfer payments. So if you want to put TR on your notes as a shorthand for total reserves, just make a big note in your margin that TR has a different meaning in your notes that you're taking today than it had in the notes that you took 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to write out total reserves rather than shorthanded. So the supply of federal funds, those are banks that have some excess reserves. Their total reserves are greater than their excess reserves, so they're willing to lend them. They like lending because it makes them some interest income, which is how they increase their profit margin. The demand for federal funds, those are the banks that don't have enough reserves and need to borrow some in order to meet the federal reserve requirement. The interaction of those two things is going to give us an equilibrium. So just find the intersection of demand and supply. That's going to give us the equilibrium, and that'll determine the equilibrium federal funds rate. So I'll call it FFR for the little star on it, FFR star, to designate the equilibrium federal funds rate. Shifts in demand and shifts in supply are going to have the same effect that we always have, right? So increase in demand increases the price, decrease in demand decreases the price, increase in supply decreases the price, decrease in supply increases the price. Same thing that happens in any market where we've got supply and demand curves moving around. The next interesting question then is, how is it that those changes in supply and demand happen? So the Fed is able to influence the federal funds rate, but notice I'm saying influence and not set. So this is a market, and the market clears, and the market price is not set by the government, it's not set by the Fed. The market price, just like the market price of yogurt or yen, comes from the interaction of demand and supply. It comes from the interaction of people who are trying to borrow and people who are trying to lend excess reserves. The Fed cannot set the federal funds rate. They can have a goal for what they want the federal funds rate to be. They can try to influence the federal funds rate by trying to affect the demand and the supply of federal funds, but they can't say to banks, you must charge this interest rate. The banks have free will to charge whatever interest rate the borrowing bank is willing to pay. So it's a standard transaction, just like buying yogurt. There is no price control in this market. So the Fed's going to influence the federal funds rate, not set it, but influence it, by changing the amount of reserves in the banking system. If the Fed increases the amount of reserves in the banking system, well, that's going to mean that there's going to be an increase in the supply of federal funds because there'll be more banks that have excess reserves. So if there's more reserves in the banking system, then there are more excess reserves. Banks that had excess reserves now have even more excess reserves. Banks that didn't have excess reserves now have excess reserves. And so an increase in the amount of reserves in the banking system means there's going to be an increase in the number of banks that want to lend in this federal funds market. At the same time, that increase in the number of reserves in the banking system is going to decrease the demand for federal funds. If there's more reserves out there in the banking system, there are fewer banks that need to borrow because they already have enough reserves to cover the reserve requirement. And those that still need to borrow probably need to borrow less. And so both of those things, the number of banks and the number of dollars, those are decreasing the demand for federal funds. Well, we already know what happens to price when demand decreases and supply increases. Both of those things have the same effect on price, so they both decrease the price of federal funds, which is to say they decrease the federal funds rate. Flip side, if the Fed wants to, if the Fed decreases reserves in the banking system, well, if the Fed takes reserves out of the banking system so the banks have fewer reserves, then the first part of that is going to be there are fewer reserves in the banks, and so the supply of federal funds will go down. There will be fewer banks with excess reserves, lowering the amount of reserves offered for loan overnight to other banks. And those banks that do have excess reserves are likely to have a smaller amount of those excess reserves, which is another piece of decreasing the amount of loans that are being offered. At the same time, if the Fed has decreased the reserves in the banking system, that's going to increase the demand for federal funds. There will be more banks that don't have enough reserves to cover their requirement, and so they'll be wanting to borrow. And those banks that are needing to borrow are likely to have even less reserves than they had before, which increases the amount they need to borrow. Both of those things are shifting our demand for federal funds to the right. We already know that an increase in demand and a decrease in supply have the same effect on price. Both of those things operate to increase the price of federal funds, which is to say increase the federal funds rate. So if the Fed changes the amount of reserves in the banking system, that should change the federal funds rate. That action of changing the amount of reserves in the banking system, that's called federal open market operations. FOMO, or federal open market operations, which I guess would be this tactic at this point. That is the way in which the Fed traditionally has changed the federal funds rate. So traditionally they changed the federal funds rate by buying, if they buy assets, we talked about this on Monday, if the Fed buys assets from other banks, they'll pay for those assets by increasing the reserves of the bank. That'll increase the reserves of the banking system and have the effect that we have up there at the top. If, on the other hand, if the Fed were to purchase assets, purchasing and buying is the same thing. If the Fed were to sell assets, to other banks, again, a free will thing, they can't force the banks to buy them, but if they offer them at a good price, the banks are likely to. If they were to sell assets to other banks, the banks would pay for those assets with their reserves. It would decrease the reserves that the banks are holding. So that's how the Fed traditionally has tried to influence this federal funds rate by its action. It's called FOMO, or federal open market operations. It's purchases and sales of financial assets from individuals and from banks. Now, the disadvantage to this traditional strategy is the Fed can influence, but it can't control the federal funds rate. They can set a target for the federal funds rate, and they do. They say, we want the federal funds rate to be 1.75%, or we want the federal funds rate to be 0.5%, or whatever. They can take action to influence the rate by increasing or decreasing the amount of reserves in the banking system, whichever way they need to go to get to the target. But the Fed doesn't determine the federal funds rate. The Fed cannot force the banks to lend at its target rate. So if the Fed says, our target is a federal funds rate of 0.5%, the banks can say, that's sweet. What do you have for Thanksgiving? We're going to charge 0.9%. The banks can do whatever the borrowing partner is willing to pay. So they cannot tell the banks, you must do this. All right, click your question. Quick recall. Federal funds rate is A, the rate one bank charges another bank on overnight loans of reserves. B, determined by the market. C, influenced by the Fed's purchase and sales of treasury bills and other assets. Just think of that generally as financial assets. D, responsive to how many excess reserves are in the banking system. E, all of the above. Question. 3 seconds. 1001, 1002, 1003, and stop. E. So all 4 of those things are true. It says 79%. I'm going to guess there's a bunch of people who are just clicking A and not actually choosing A. I'm just hoping. Right? So the federal funds rate is the rate that all of that's true. A, B, C, and D. All of that describes the federal funds rate. The Fed is changing what they're going to do. The Fed's changing what they're going to do. So this is where I edited the slide. So if you didn't re-download the slides after like 10:45 this morning, there's a few edits which I tried to show with strikeouts and so on here. So they're changing the policy tactic. I initially said the tool, but I'm going to change it to tactic to stick with the language I had on that earlier slide. The Fed is changing their tactic. Instead of trying to achieve a particular federal funds rate through open market operations, which has been the tactic that they've been using to try to achieve a particular federal funds rate, what the Fed has announced is that starting now, that what they're going to do instead is they're going to change the interest rate that they pay on excess reserves. So let me back it up. Let me see if the slide backs it up. No. All right. So in legislation that was passed before the crisis, the Fed decided that they would start paying banks some interest on the balances in their reserve account. So it used to be that if banks had any balance in their reserve account, they earned zero interest on that. And so the obvious thing for the banks to do was to turn around and lend out those funds to some sort of borrower, you, me, businesses, whatever, because that was the way they were going to earn some interest income on those reserves and thereby make profit, which is the goal of banks. In legislation that was passed in 2006 and implemented in 2008, the Fed decided they're going to start paying interest to banks on the balances they have in their reserve accounts. They actually have two different interest rates, which right now are at the same rate. So that they have the interest rate, how should I put this? I'll put the interest rate they're paying on the required reserves. So that's the interest that the Fed is paying to banks on the balances they have in their required reserve account, and the interest rate that they're paying on excess reserves. So the amount that the Fed will pay to banks on the balances they have in their excess reserves. Right now, both of those things are the same. So right now they're paying 0.25% to banks for the balances. That's what banks are earning on the balances in their reserve accounts. They can change one and not the other. And what the Fed announced is that as they move to increase interest rates, which we expect they will do soon, you're going to work out why on the problem set. As they move to increase interest rates, instead of using the tactic of open market operations to increase interest rates, they're going to use the interest rate on excess reserves. So what they're going to do is they're going to start changing the interest rate that they pay banks on the balances in the bank's excess reserves. If they want interest rates to increase, they're going to start paying banks a higher rate of interest on what they have in their excess reserves. Remember when you did the investment game in section? So some of you were buying food trucks and some of you were banks. And the people who were banks, it said at the top that you had an opportunity cost of your funds. First round it was 6%, second round it was 10%, rounds 3 through 6 it was 6%. That opportunity cost of the funds for the banks, that's the rate the Fed pays on excess reserves. So in the game I said it at 6%, I said it at a really high rate just to make the game sort of more interesting. Right now that opportunity cost, that is, what could the bank do, what could the bank earn if they just held on to the excess reserves? Right now that's 0.25%. As the Fed increases that, suppose that the Fed, instead of paying 0.25%, let's take an extreme example. Suppose the Fed starts paying banks 5% on their excess reserves. That's 5% interest, that's risk-free, right? There's no chance that the Fed isn't going to pay up. There's no chance the Fed's going to default. So that's 5% risk-free on any balance they have in their excess reserves. Would a bank be willing to loan to you at anything below 5% if they could get 5% from the Federal Reserve? No. So that's going to set a floor, a bottom, for what's the interest rate that banks are willing to loan money at. Because they can get whatever the excess reserve rate is, that they can get from the Fed, and that's risk-free. So they're not going to make loans to anybody for below that risk-free rate, which is the interest rate paid on excess reserves. What the Fed has announced, in the link is at the bottom of the slide, is that what they're going to do going forward is instead of worrying about trying to find the right amount of reserves to add to the system to bring the equilibrium of supply and demand for Federal Reserves into exactly the rate that the Fed was targeting, something they were spectacularly unsuccessful at starting in 2007, the Fed is going to, instead of using FOMO, they're going to use this changing the interest rates on excess reserves. So if they want the federal funds rate, the rate that banks charge each other on overnight loans, if they want the federal funds rate to go up to 1%, then they're going to increase the interest rate they pay on excess reserves to 1%. If they want the federal funds rate to go up to 1.5%, they're going to increase the interest rate they pay on excess reserves to 1.5%. So they're going to start announcing what's the interest rate they're paying on excess reserves. The advantage to this new tactic is that they can have complete, perfect, 100% control over the interest rate they pay on excess reserves. They didn't have control over the federal funds rate. They still don't. They can't tell banks, you must lend at this rate. But they do have perfect control over what they pay the banks. And so what they pay the banks is going to be the new floor for interest rates. And what they expect is that lending overnight to other banks is pretty much risk-free. So they think the federal funds rate will be pretty much equal to the interest rate they pay on excess reserves. And so they're going to start moving that interest rate on excess reserves up. So a couple edits I want to do. If the Fed wants banks to, let me edit here, if they want banks to increase the federal funds rate and decrease their lending to the public, the Fed's going to increase the rate they're paying on excess reserves. That's going to be the tactic. They'll increase the rate they're paying on excess reserves. That'll lead banks to increase the federal fund rate, which is what they charge on those overnight loans between banks. It's also going to lead them to decrease their lending to the public. So that's the example I just gave about if the opportunity cost goes from 0.25 to 5%. There's a whole lot of projects that are no longer profitable. There's going to be less lending to businesses. If the Fed wants banks to, let me edit this, if they want banks to decrease the federal funds rate and increase their lending to the public, the Fed's going to decrease the rate they pay on excess reserves. And the link is there at the bottom. I reloaded these slides just before class, so if you don't, that's a lot to try to write down. That link is on the slides. I reloaded them this morning so you can get it off the slides. Can I help you? Okay. It's an odd day. It's a very odd day. Okay. All right, so is that good? So once the Fed changes the interest rates on excess reserves, which is going to change the federal funds rate, then those two interest rates are going to influence all the other interest rates. There's a whole lot of interest rates. And in the book, I run through this long list of all sorts of interest rates. The ones that are most important for understanding macroeconomics, the prime rate, that's the interest rate that banks charge to their best commercial customers. It tends to be the sort of headline rate that you read about in the newspaper. It's not immediately clear to me how many businesses actually get to borrow at that rate, but it certainly is a headline number. It's one that they announce in the news and so on. The higher federal funds rate influences home mortgage rates, so the interest rate you pay if you're borrowing to buy a house. It influences home equity loan rates. Home equity loans are loans that homeowners can take out typically from banks where the collateral, that is what they lose if they don't pay back the loan, the collateral is their house. And they're able to take out this loan because the value of their house is greater than the existing loan on their house, which is to say they have equity. Let me write some of that down. So here, if you have a house, let's just draw a house. Here's a house. We'll put smoke out of the windows. Here's a door. Here's some windows. It's a happy house. Anyway, so there's a house, such as it is. Suppose that your house could sell, not that you're going to sell it, but suppose you could sell the house for $500,000. So other houses in the neighborhood that are comparable to this house are currently selling for $500,000. And suppose you owe $200,000 on the mortgage. So you still have $200,000 you have to pay back to the bank for this house. The difference between what the house could sell for, not what you paid for it, but what it could sell for if you were to sell it today. The difference between what you could sell the house for and what you still owe on it is called the equity in the home. And so in my example, that would be $300,000. Again, that's not the difference between what you paid and what you owe. It's the difference between what the house could sell